Economic sanctions, the deliberate restriction of trade and financial access to coerce political changes, have become the dominant tool of great power competition in the modern era, used more frequently than military force, affecting more countries, shaping more outcomes, and yet operating largely invisibly to publics who rarely see or understand their mechanisms or consequences. And while sanctions are presented as peaceful alternative to war, as diplomatic pressure that avoids bloodshed, the reality is far more complex and often darker. Comprehensive sanctions can be more devastating than limited military campaigns, can cause more civilian deaths through starvation and medical shortages than bombs and bullets, can destroy economies and impoverish entire generations, can cripple countries for decades, and can do all this while maintaining plausible deniability, while allowing the imposing power to claim it's pursuing peace while actually waging economic warfare in the modern sanctions regime, centered on American control of the dollar and of global financial networks, represents a form of power that's unprecedented in history. The ability to exclude countries from the global economy with the stroke of a pen, to freeze billions in assets, to prevent transactions, to deny access to essential imports, and to do all this without declaring war, without congressional authorization in many cases, without public debate about costs and consequences. And this weapon has been used with increasing frequency and severity. The number of sanctioned countries and entities has exploded over the past 3 decades, from a handful during the Cold War to dozens now. And the scope has expanded from narrow targeted sanctions on specific weapons programs or individuals to comprehensive sanctions that effectively blockade entire economies. And while sanctions sometimes achieve their stated goals, more often they fail to change target regimes' behavior while succeeding spectacularly at immiserating ordinary people who have no power to change the policies that triggered the sanctions, creating humanitarian disasters while allowing sanctioning countries to claim moral high ground, and understanding how sanctions actually work, who they hurt and who they benefit, why they're used so frequently despite limited effectiveness, and what this reveals about modern power and about the gap between stated intentions and actual consequences. This is essential to understanding contemporary geopolitics and to evaluating whether sanctions deserve their reputation as humane alternative to war or whether they're actually a brutal weapon that kills indiscriminately while providing political cover for economic warfare. The history of sanctions as systematic tool begins after World War I. The League of Nations Charter included provisions for economic sanctions against aggressor nations, and these were seen as revolutionary, as a way to enforce international law without military force, through collective economic pressure that would make aggression too costly. And this vision was tested when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The League imposed sanctions, prohibited arms sales, and certain trade with Italy. But the sanctions were limited, didn't include oil, weren't enforced rigorously, and failed to stop Italian conquest, demonstrating early on the fundamental problems with sanctions, that they require broad participation to be effective, that target countries can often find alternative suppliers and markets, that powerful countries can resist or circumvent sanctions, and that limited sanctions rarely coerce major policy changes. But the idea persisted that economic pressure could substitute for military force, that modern economies were so interdependent that denial of trade and finance could compel compliance with international norms. And this idea was embraced after World War II, written into the UN Charter, and became foundation for post-war international order, the assumption that economic coercion could maintain peace. The Cold War saw limited use of sanctions because the world was divided into 2 economic blocs. The West couldn't effectively sanction the Soviet bloc because the Soviets had their own trade network through Comecon, weren't dependent on Western trade or finance. And the Soviets similarly couldn't sanction the West, so sanctions were used primarily against smaller countries that weren't firmly in either camp. American sanctions on Cuba beginning in 1960 were paradigmatic, designed to strangle the Cuban economy, to create such hardship that the population would overthrow Castro. But after 60 years, the Castro regime and its successors remain in power while the Cuban economy has been devastated. GDP per capita far below what it might have been with normal trade relations, shortages of basic goods chronic. All of this suffering inflicted on Cuban people who didn't choose their government and can't change it. and the Cuba sanctions demonstrate the fundamental dysfunction of comprehensive sanctions. They hurt the wrong people, harm the population rather than the regime, often strengthen the regime by creating rally-around-the-flag effects, and by allowing the regime to blame external enemies for internal failures. And they persist long after their original rationale has disappeared. Cuba is no longer a Soviet proxy, no longer a significant threat to the United States. But the sanctions continue because of domestic American politics, because Cuban exile communities in Florida demand them, because no administration wants to be accused of being soft on communism. So sanctions that fail to achieve their goals and that cause tremendous suffering persist indefinitely because the political costs of lifting them exceed the costs of maintaining them. The end of the Cold War saw explosion in sanctions use. The United States and the UN Security Council imposed sanctions on Iraq after the 1990 invasion of Kuwait, and these sanctions, maintained for over a decade, were the most comprehensive ever imposed, essentially blockading Iraq, preventing most trade, freezing assets, destroying the economy, and the humanitarian consequences were catastrophic. Iraqi GDP collapsed by over 60%, child mortality increased dramatically, the medical system deteriorated as hospitals couldn't obtain medicines or equipment, infrastructure degraded as spare parts and materials were embargoed, and estimates suggested that hundreds of thousands of children died from malnutrition and preventable diseases caused by the sanctions. UNICEF and other organizations documented the humanitarian disaster, and when Madeleine Albright, then U.S. Secretary of State, was asked in a 1996 interview whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children was worth the price of containing Saddam Hussein, she answered, "We think the price is worth it." A statement that crystallized the brutal calculus of comprehensive sanctions, the willingness to accept mass civilian suffering to achieve political goals. And while the number 500,000 was disputed and probably exaggerated, there's no doubt that sanctions killed tens of thousands of Iraqi children through malnutrition and disease. And this was known and accepted by the sanctioning powers as necessary cost of maintaining pressure on Saddam Hussein, who remained firmly in power, living in palaces while his people starved, demonstrating again that comprehensive sanctions harm populations while leaders insulated by power and privilege suffer minimally. The evolution towards smart sanctions, or targeted sanctions, in the late 1990s and 2000s was response to criticism of comprehensive sanctions' humanitarian costs. The idea was to target specific individuals and entities responsible for objectionable behavior rather than entire economies, to freeze assets of regime leaders and their supporters, to ban their travel, to prohibit specific transactions related to weapons programs or human rights abuses, and this seemed more ethical, more precisely targeted, less likely to cause mass civilian harm, and smart sanctions have become the dominant form, used against North Korea, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Syria, countless individuals and companies and organizations. But the reality is that smart sanctions aren't that smart. They still cause widespread economic damage. Iran's sanctions technically target the nuclear program and specific entities, but in practice, they prevent most international trade and investment because banks and companies fear violating complex sanctions regulations, fear being cut off from the dollar system. So they simply avoid doing any business with Iran, creating a de facto comprehensive embargo, and Iranian economy has collapsed. Unemployment has soared. Inflation has destroyed savings. Ordinary Iranians can't access medicines or technologies because suppliers won't risk sanctions violations. And yet the Iranian regime continues its nuclear program, continues supporting proxies, continues its regional activities, showing that even smart sanctions fail to change behavior while still inflicting mass harm. The mechanism of modern sanctions is dollar dominance. The United States can enforce sanctions globally because the dollar is the global reserve currency, because international transactions typically involve dollars at some point, because dollar transactions clear through American banks and payment systems, and the United States can threaten any bank or company that violates American sanctions with exclusion from the dollar system. And this threat is devastating. No major bank or multinational corporation can operate without access to dollars and to American financial markets. So they comply with American sanctions even when their own governments don't support the sanctions. Even when the sanctions violate their country's sovereignty, European companies have been forced to stop doing business with Iran despite European governments opposing American withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. Because American threatened secondary sanctions, threatened to punish any entity that continued trading with Iran, and European companies chose to maintain their access to American markets rather than defy American sanctions, demonstrating that dollar hegemony gives America extraterritorial power, the ability to enforce American law globally, to compel compliance with American policy preferences even from countries that disagree. And this is unprecedented power. No previous hegemon has had this ability to coerce global compliance with its unilateral decisions, and this power is exercised increasingly aggressively. American sanctions have proliferated, the number of sanctioned entities has increased exponentially, and the threshold for imposing sanctions has lowered. Sanctions that once required congressional action now can be imposed by executive order. Sanctions that once were reserved for major threats now are used for routine diplomatic disputes. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, the Treasury Department office that administers American sanctions, has become one of the most powerful bureaucracies in the world. OFAC maintains lists of thousands of sanctioned individuals and entities. The specially designated nationals list alone has over 10,000 entries, and being placed on this list is economic death sentence. Your assets in any jurisdiction connected to the dollar system are frozen. You can't conduct transactions in dollars. You can't travel to countries that cooperate with American sanctions. You can't do business with most international companies, and getting off the list is nearly impossible. There's limited due process, limited ability to challenge designation. The burden is on the sanctioned party to prove they should be removed, and OFAC operates with minimal oversight. Congress rarely scrutinizes sanctions policy. Courts defer to executive authority on national security the public is largely unaware of. OFAC's activities, and this concentration of power in a single bureaucracy that can destroy businesses and impoverish individuals and countries with administrative decisions, with no declaration of war, no trial, no meaningful appeal. This is troubling from rule of law perspective, represents extraordinary unchecked power. And while OFAC's defenders argue that this power is necessary to combat terrorism and weapons proliferation and human rights abuses, the reality is that it's often used to punish political enemies, to advance narrow American interests, to coerce behavior that has nothing to do with security threats. The effectiveness of sanctions is disputed. Studies suggest that comprehensive sanctions achieve their stated goals perhaps 30% of the time, which means they fail 70% of the time, and even when they succeed, the success is often partial or ambiguous. South African apartheid sanctions are cited as success case. Sanctions imposed by the international community from the 1960s through 1980s are credited with contributing to apartheid's end in the early 1990s, but the causation is complex. Sanctions coincided with internal resistance, with changing demographics, with economic changes that were making apartheid unsustainable, and with Cold War's end which reduced Western tolerance for apartheid as an anti-communist ally. So whether sanctions caused the change or just accompanied it is unclear, but even if we credit sanctions with contributing, it took 3 decades. And during those decades, South African blacks suffered economically from sanctions that reduced employment and investment. So even the success case involved tremendous suffering over a very long period, and most sanctions don't achieve even this ambiguous success. North Korea has been under severe sanctions for decades and has developed nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Russia has been under increasing sanctions since 2014 and has continued aggressive actions, including invading Ukraine. Venezuela has been under crushing sanctions, and the Maduro regime remains in power. Cuba and Iran is already discussed. So the empirical evidence suggests sanctions rarely work as intended, rarely coerce major policy changes from target regimes, and yet they continue to be imposed with increasing frequency because they serve political purposes even when they fail strategic ones. The political logic of sanctions is that they allow governments to do something in response to problems without the costs and risks of military force. When there's political pressure to respond to human rights abuses or aggression or weapons proliferation, sanctions allow leaders to claim they're taking strong action, and sanctions can be imposed quickly, unilaterally, without congressional approval in many cases, without risking soldiers' lives. without the financial costs of military campaigns. So they're attractive to politicians who need to appear tough, but who don't want to actually fight. And sanctions also satisfy domestic constituencies. Cuban exiles want Cuba sanctioned. Human rights groups want sanctioned regimes that commit abuses. Defense hawks want sanctions on potential adversaries. And imposing sanctions satisfies these constituencies at minimal political cost. The people harmed by sanctions, Cubans and Iranians and North Koreans and Russians, they don't vote in American elections, so their suffering imposes no political cost on American politicians, while the domestic constituencies that support sanctions are politically active and organized, so the political incentives favor imposing sanctions regardless of effectiveness, favor maintaining sanctions even when they're clearly not working, because lifting sanctions is politically costly, is seen as weakness, as capitulation, while imposing and maintaining sanctions is seen as strength, as moral clarity, even when the actual effect is to harm civilians while failing to change regime behavior. The humanitarian consequences of comprehensive sanctions are severe and are borne primarily by the most vulnerable. In Iraq in the 1990s, in North Korea today, in Venezuela, in Syria, sanctions create shortages of food and medicine, destroy healthcare systems, cause malnutrition and preventable deaths, particularly among children and the elderly and the chronically ill. And these humanitarian costs are often dismissed as acceptable collateral damage, as the price of putting pressure on bad regimes. But this reasoning is morally dubious. Intentionally inflicting suffering on civilian populations to coerce political change is, under different names, terrorism or collective punishment, both of which are considered war crimes. But when done through sanctions, it's considered legitimate statecraft, and the double standard is striking. We condemn dictators for starving their people, but we think it's acceptable to starve people to pressure dictators. We consider it a war crime too. Deliberately target civilian infrastructure, but sanctions that destroy economies and prevent access to food and medicine are seen as acceptable. And the people who suffer have no recourse, can't change their government's policies even if they wanted to, have no way to end the sanctions. So they just suffer for years or decades, while the sanctioning countries claim moral high ground for avoiding military force. The secondary effects of sanctions extend beyond target countries. Neighboring countries suffer from reduced trade, from refugee flows, from instability that spills across borders. Companies that depend on trade with sanctioned countries lose business, sometimes going bankrupt, workers lose jobs, and the global economy suffers from reduced trade and increased uncertainty. And there are geopolitical effects. Sanctions drive target countries together, create alliances of the sanctioned, Russia, and Iran and China cooperating to evade sanctions and to create alternative financial systems. And this sanctions resistance is increasingly organized. China's CIPS payment system is alternative to SWIFT. Digital currencies are being developed to circumvent dollar-based sanctions. Bilateral trade agreements bypass dollar settlements. And as more countries face sanctions or fear they might be sanctioned, the incentive to develop alternatives increases, and this could eventually undermine the very dollar hegemony that makes American sanctions effective. Could create the conditions where sanctions no longer work because countries have alternatives to the dollar system. So aggressive use of sanctions might be self-defeating in the long run, might accelerate the end of dollar dominance, and with it the end of American ability to impose its preferences globally through financial coercion. The legal and ethical questions about sanctions are under-examined. Is it legitimate for one country to enforce its law extraterritorially, to punish companies in other countries for violating American law even when they're complying with their own country's laws? This violates traditional notions of sovereignty, and it's only possible because of dollar hegemony, because America has the power to compel compliance. But does might make right? Is this a legitimate exercise of power, or is it imperialism, economic imperialism that subordinates other countries' sovereignty to American preferences? And what about due process? Sanctioned individuals and entities often have no meaningful opportunity to contest their designation, no trial, no ability to confront evidence. OFAC designations are based on classified intelligence that isn't disclosed, so you can't challenge it. You're guilty until you prove yourself innocent, and proving innocence to the satisfaction of a bureaucracy that has no incentive to admit error is nearly impossible, and this violates basic legal principles that most countries claim to uphold. And what about proportionality? Are comprehensive sanctions that destroy economies and harm millions proportional to the violations they're meant to address? Is starving children to pressure governments proportional punishment for nuclear programs or human rights abuses that the children had no part in? And who decides? Who has the authority to impose this? Suffering, is it legitimate for one country, even a powerful one, to appoint itself judge and executioner of global norms? Or should this require international consensus, UN authorization, some form of legitimacy beyond unilateral American decision? The alternatives to sanctions are limited and unsatisfying. Diplomacy often fails to achieve goals, requires compromise and patience and acceptance that other countries have different interests. Military force is costly and risky and often makes problems worse, as Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated. So if we reject both sanctions and military force, what tools remain for addressing genuine problems? Proliferation and terrorism and aggression and human rights abuses, and there's no good answer. Maybe the answer is accepting that some problems can't be solved through coercion, that sovereignty means tolerating other countries' choices even when we find them abhorrent, that the costs of trying to impose our preferences exceed the benefits. But this is politically impossible. Publics demand action. Politicians need to appear strong. And the entire post-World War II international order is based on the assumption that powerful countries can and should enforce norms, should prevent aggression and atrocities and proliferation. So we're left with sanctions as the least bad option, as the tool that allows us to claim we're doing something without the costs and risks of war. Even though sanctions often don't work and often cause tremendous suffering. And maybe we need to be more honest about this. Need to acknowledge that sanctions are warfare by other means, that they kill and impoverish just less visibly than bombs, that they fail most of the time, that they harm the innocent more than the guilty, but that we impose them anyway because political imperatives override humanitarian and strategic concerns, because appearing to act is more important than acting effectively, because the costs are borne by people far away who don't vote here, while the benefits accrue to domestic constituencies who do. The weapon that won wars without firing a shot is a myth. Sanctions don't win wars. They sometimes contribute to outcomes, but rarely decisively. And they do fire shots, economic shots that kill through starvation and disease rather than through bullets, that destroy futures and possibilities rather than buildings, that impoverish generations rather than armies. And these deaths and this destruction are no less real for being economic rather than kinetic, and the idea that sanctions are peaceful, or a humane alternative to war is propaganda, is a story we tell ourselves to feel good about coercion, to maintain that we're the good guys even as we deliberately inflict suffering on millions. The reality is that sanctions are a weapon, powerful and destructive, that we use frequently because we can, because dollar hegemony gives us the power to use them without consequences to ourselves. And because they serve political purposes even when they fail strategic ones, they allow us to claim moral high ground while waging economic warfare, to punish enemies while avoiding accountability, to shape global economy to serve our interests while claiming to enforce universal norms. And this power is unprecedented and largely unchecked and increasingly resisted. And whether it survives the next few decades depends partly on whether we use it more judiciously, whether we acknowledge its costs and limitations, whether we develop alternatives that are actually effective rather than just politically convenient, or whether we continue expanding sanctions until we've sanctioned so many countries that they collectively develop alternatives that render our sanctions irrelevant, destroying the very power that sanctions depend on and leaving us with neither sanctions nor the dollar hegemony that enables them. A victim of our own overuse of a weapon that seemed powerful and cost-free, but that was actually fragile and self-limiting. A weapon that won nothing while firing countless shots that killed invisibly, leaving us diminished and the world more fractured. The legacy of a power we wielded without wisdom and that we'll regret having relied on when it's gone, and we realize that coercion without legitimacy is power that can't endure.